So, if a company cared more about its users than its share price, and it learned about a breach in 2016, wouldn't it have notified its users in 2016?
Well, I think it's important to note that the trust of people who use Facebook is paramount, and it's critical not only to our ethical obligations, but to our business obligations as well, because we realize if people don't feel like their information is protected on Facebook, they won't feel comfortable using our services. And so while certainly information about...
So why didn't you notify users in 2016?
Well, I think what our CEO Mark Zuckerberg has said is that in retrospect we should have done that. And going forward, if a situation like this occurs, then we will certainly do that.
Can you explain? So in the Canadian context, if I heard the numbers right, well, first the international context, it was 350,000 or so people consented to using an application and allowed the app developer to access 87 million user profiles. In Canada, if I've got it right, it's 272 people accessed it, giving access to 620,000 plus Canadian user profiles. How is that in compliance with the existing law?
Well, I think those numbers are generally correct, but it's important to note that we've taken a conservative approach here. We don't have perfect information exactly about which information was transferred at which time. So what we've aimed to do is err on the side of caution and notify more people rather than less.
No, I appreciate that in terms of the numbers, but in terms of our legislation here in Canada, PIPEDA, which requires consent, usually explicit consent, in some cases implied consent, where was the consent of 620,000 users?
Well, I think the approach that we've taken at the time, and as I mentioned in my opening statement, we've made significant changes to platforms since this information was available to restrict the information that app developers can receive. For the 272 people who specifically authorized the app, there was a screen that popped up that would have notified them of what information the developer wanted to receive, and
they can't consent on behalf of other people. Right?
With regard to the...
Sorry, it seems to me that you made changes, perhaps you're in compliance with the law now, but it seems pretty clear that you weren't in compliance with the law previously. Is that fair?
Well, I think with regard to the people who were friends of those affected, or those who were using the app, our data policy and our disclosures at the time were very clear that this is how platform worked. I think it's important to note that as our changes in 2014 reflect, we don't think that's the right way for platform to operate, and it's not the way that platform operates today. But this is something that at the time and since we've been in discussions with the Privacy Commissioner of Canada about. And so while we think that it's not the appropriate way for a platform to operate, we also want to make sure that we're in compliance with all applicable laws.
Yeah, not only is it not an appropriate way, but it's also contrary to our law, the way you previously had designed the system. 2014, you've made changes, but all of those app developers who have previously collected information still have that information. Can you give a sense to Canadians of exactly what detailed information that entails? So my understanding is for app developers, they would have had access to the education, work affiliation, personal relationships, friends lists, likes, location. What else?
Well, obviously, the specific information that's affected depends on the specific app. Apps would have had
situation.
To go,
What's the worst situation? The most personal information that would have been shared with app developers?
So app developers would have had the ability to receive information that people have shared on their profiles, things like their likes, their city, where they live, those kinds of information. We've made changes since then, and those were pieces of information that were shared under the privacy settings of the person affected. So you would have had the ability to choose whether to share the information in the first place. You would have had the ability to choose who to share it with. So you might have shared it with some friends, but not others. And you would have had the ability to choose whether those friends could bring that information to apps. Now, as I mentioned, since then, we've significantly restricted the amount of information that's available to apps.
There's an app developer of a cow clicker game who posted on the Atlantic, and he said it was a really rudimentary game. And if I had clicked on that app and played this ridiculous cow clicker game, this app developer would have had access to my friend's marital status. Does that make sense to you?
It doesn't. It's one of those things that in our developer policies, which we require all developers to abide by, we impose a series of restrictions on what information they can collect and how they can use it. Among those restrictions is a rule that says developers cannot ask for more information than they need to actually operate the service that they're providing. And since 2014, we've operated an upfront review process that looks at that among many other things. But I think certainly, it's not our intention that apps use Facebook platform to collect information that they don't need. And as we announced several weeks ago, we're making much more significant restrictions in the amount of information that most apps can get.
Unfortunately, those changes are only being made once this situation has been made public, and not because you ever thought it was the right thing to do. Thanks very much. Now, you've spoken about this being a breach of trust, and you've really highlighted the importance of building up the trust of your user base. That's fair, yeah? Okay, so is it also fair to say that in building up the trust of your users, it's incredibly important, perhaps most important, to be as open and honest as possible? You think that's fair? Yes?
I think that's fair.
Yes, sir. That's right.
Okay, so I asked about personal information being shared without consent previously, and what the most personal and most sensitive information might be that was shared without users' consent. Mr. Sherman, you gave an example of likes. You didn't mention private messages, though, and I have a notice in front of me from an individual who did not access This Is My Digital Life, but a friend did, and it indicates that for a small number of users, doesn't indicate what percentage or how many, that their posts, timeline, but also messages may have been shared. Can you comment on that?
We're still in the process of investigating and looking into the records that we have with regard to what was shared with This Is Your Digital Life. As I've said previously, we want to undertake a forensic audit to look at the information that's in Cambridge Analytica's possession and make sure we understand that. It is possible that private messages were shared in small amounts as a part of that. That's something that was allowed on the platform at the time.
In your opinion, based on the evidence you've reviewed to date, do you think that private messages were shared without users' consent?
I believe it's possible, but I think it's something that we need to confirm.
Okay. In the interest of being as open and honest with Canadians as possible, why haven't you mentioned local blocks today?
I'm sorry, can you explain what you mean?
So we had Chris Vickery attend before us earlier this week, who discussed 48 million additional users having their information shared in some improper fashion. Are you familiar with the context of that?
I am, yes.
Okay, so are you also familiar that Local Blocks was the company that was scraping user profiles?
I think we, as I mentioned before, the problem of scraping is one that we deal with at Facebook and that any internet service deals with, and it's one of the things that we announced as a part of a series of changes that we're making this past week, that we're dealing with situations where public information that's just generally available on the internet is acquired in large scale, and this is sort of the practice that we refer to as scraping. We have technical measures that are in place to deal with that and to identify when that happens. So, for example, looking at large scale automated efforts to collect information. That's a violation of our rules. We detect it many of the times when people try to engage in it, but it's very clear from that example that you've given that we need to do more. I think I referred earlier to some of the...
Isn't it also clear, though, that you should be... I mean, you've indicated the importance of building up the trust of your user base, and then the only reason you're talking about Local Blocks and 48 million users having their information scraped is because I asked you about it. It's just really curious to me when you've already indicated that being open and honest is so very important.